have you got any thoughts on early church history generally, and how you found it all? I mean, I understand it's been quite a struggle for some of you.
I've really enjoyed the discussion about the Trinity.
Okay.
Yes. And how people have had trouble getting their heads around it. And I find now I'm looking at the services saying, well, how does this relate? Isn't this sort of not getting the Trinity quite right? And all the time in the services, the prayers, how are they coping with Trinity? So, yeah.
The prayer book prayers basically get the Trinity right, I think. And there was a big fuss in as recently as about 2016 in terms of the Trinity. And a lot of evangelicals were probably not getting it right because they were making the Son subservient to the Father. And the creeds are actually very clear that the Son is not subservient to the Father in any way. And that was a big deal. It caused huge ruptions in parts of particularly the evangelical church, because it was also being used. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians. Now I've got to be a little bit careful again in Sydney. So it was this, you see, 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3. Paul says, there's one thing I want you to know, the head of every man is Christ. The head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And in effect, they were using the authority or the fathers, or the Son being subservient to the Father, to support their argument that therefore the woman is subservient to the man. And they had clearly got their theology wrong, because you interpret something which happens to apply to a situation and make it global, sort of universal, which it's not.
So the first bit though, where it's the head of Christ is God, that's confusing too.
It is, and he's making a point about people within the Trinity being answerable to each other. Anyway, they've all changed their minds. They all realised they were wrong. So, but it's funny that it would come up as recently as 2016.
So they can't use that argument.
They can't use that argument. No.
They can't use that verse anymore from Corinthians to argue that women aren't allowed to do
No, and they've stopped doing it, I think, in general. I'm not saying that nobody will do it, I'm not saying you'll never come across it, but it was huge at the time. Yeah.
I was going to say that. Louise, did you want to ask something?
I was only thinking, like with what Glenn has said, that I don't think I thought about that issue and how hard it would have been, but because we've discussed it.
It looks like we've got a picture here, though that's the third one. But
want to run the slideshow?
Can we
just run the cursor to here?
Yeah, it's got to get, but I had to minimize it again to be able to.
Oh, look at that! Now, that's not actually the first one I wanted to show, but I can sort of just about cope with that. But if you can go back to perfect. I'm sorry, that does look like a picture of Ruth, but it's that is Mount Ararat, and I thought you'd be interested to know that was Mount Ararat. That's just for general interest. So we are in Armenia, and Mount Ararat is in Turkey across the border, though they call that area of Armenia, they call it Ararat, and obviously there's a historical reason as borders change and everything. Yeah, pretty well. It's actually quite a stunning view. I don't know whether the picture does it justice. Yeah, move me out of the way. It probably looks even better. If you can't, then you can't. Yeah.
Click on the black banner. Just move it.
Oh, look at that. Yeah. The Turks are a little bit protective of Mount Ararat, but that's it. And so that's Armenia. Okay, so if we can go on to the next picture, then just quickly, and I'm doing this quickly because I think we've got other things that we need to look at.
The screen sharing.
This is the this is just the slideshow to keep us slightly entertained.
Hit the resume share.
Did we find the mouse? Oh, here's the mouse. Okay, is that the resume share? Is that the resume share? No,
Where's the green one?
this one.
Resume share. There we are. Now what have we got now?
Okay. I don't know. Was that? Isn't that what you told me to do?
Yep.
Next share. No.
Now just come down to the.
Stop share. This
No.
one. You are sharing.
Yeah, there.
Where? Oh, this great. This.
Yeah, click on that.
Is it
No,
mine?
no.
Click on the screen.
Click on
Just
screen.
click on the screen.
That's it.
And now we just got to go
Next
back
one.
to the slideshow, and then okay. So the next one is I just maybe
Sorry
go
about
this way.
Oh, look at
Is
that.
that the next
There we
one?
go.
Now I'm just showing these because
See that arrow there?
we're doing monasticism partly today, and that isn't a crazy. It's in Georgia, and you know, that's the sort of place that they always build these things at the top of great hills, and it's that's Necrazy, yeah, in Georgia, and that's been operating since the 6th century. So interesting, and still functioning as a monastery as well. I just thought the setting looked good. Okay, and what do I press for the next one there?
That's the one. Yeah, that arrow.
That's close up. That's what it looks like after we've walked up this incredibly steep cobbled hill for what felt like about 15 Ks, but was probably about 3. And that's the sort of thing that you get. Again, it's Georgia. Georgia declared itself Christian in 337, so not as early as Armenia. And really, it was an answer to the getting rid of fire worship, and yeah, so that was what that was about. And that's another one in Georgia again, which is Gegeti. That's now an active Georgian Orthodox Church. And then we come to Uplistika, which is in those caves. And again, rickety and uneven steps, which even though I consider myself extremely fit and capable, I definitely struggled with coming back down. And that's very near Gori, which is where Joseph Stalin was born. There's a museum there that remembers Joseph Stalin. Thankfully, not to laud him, but to say, you know, this is the awful things that he did. So, I mean, he was born in Georgia, very near here. And part of that is still used as monastery. There are monks still up there in the caves. Yeah, they're very well appointed, actually, some of them, when you get up close. Okay, but it's quite a thing to get up there. And the last one is yeah, that's an Armenian one at Noravan, and that's near Yerevan, which is the capital, about 122 k's from there. And you may remember the story of Armenia, which declared itself Christian in 301 AD. At least that's the story, and has been so since the Middle Ages. And you might remember the story of King Tiridati, who was, when he executed the very beautiful Ripsina for being a Christian, he was changed into a wild boar. Do you remember that story?
No.
I know you don't. It must have been the day, one of the days you weren't here. Yes, Ripsina was the very beautiful Christian, and he executed her for being a Christian. He was changed to a wild boar, and I think it was her cousin Gregory, who had already been imprisoned, let him out of prison, asked him, said he wanted to become a Christian, declared the whole nation Christian, and Gregory became Gregory the Illuminator. So you can look up Gregory the Illuminator, but I suspect you probably won't get anything in the online exam about him, but he's all over Armenia. He's the man who brought the light of Christ to that country. So that's Armenia, and that's the finish of my pictures. And for anybody who's watching online, my apologies. We're dealing with Gary being on leave, and so you're just going to have to listen. But the people who are here around the table have got notes, and I'd be happy for them to interrupt. Okay. Monasticism. Where do we start? Well, there had been ascetics and desert communities. Sorry, I'm on my notes now. Before Christianity, but what caused so many to seek a solitary life of self-denial or to join a community with rigorously enforced rules of life and worship? Why did people do that? Edward Gibbon called such people unhappy exiles from social life, impelled by the dark and implacable genius of superstition. So I think we get the picture that he wasn't a fan. Now, Edward Gibbon is famous for having written a 6-volume history in the 18th century, which was called The History of the Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, which some of you would at least be familiar with, even if you haven't ever looked at it. It is very thorough, and amongst other people he blames for the fall of the Roman Empire is the rise of Christianity. Probably with some good reason in many ways. So that's what he writes in his history. I'm not necessarily suggesting, unless you're really dead keen, that you start trying to plow your way through all this. Okay, so let's get to what we do know. John the Baptist, wandering around the Judean desert, wearing weird clothes, eating an odd diet, and shouting, "Repent," was one like that. Jesus himself told one rich young man, and you remember, to sell his possessions. It's Matthew chapter 19, verse 21, and you'll see as we continue that verse has been absolutely vital in terms of what people did in monasticism. Paul wrote to the Galatians, this is Galatians 5:17, that the sinful nature is at war with the spirit. Now, if I just quickly read that, unless somebody gets to it before I do, Galatians, Ephesians, there we are, Galatians 5:17. The sinful nature wants to do evil, which is just the opposite of what the spirit wants. And the spirit gives us desires that are the opposite of what the sinful nature desires. These two forces are constantly fighting each other, so you are not free to carry out your good intentions. Now, unless you've sort of lived a different life from mine, you would relate to that and understand that, yes, that is so. And I think that therefore is something that makes or made these people, especially in the sort of 3rd century and 4th century, wanting to go off and do that, because they're sensing this continual fight between the natural and the spiritual. You see what I'm getting at? This is what Paul's writing about. So let me go on to the next one, because on the other hand, Jesus seems to discourage that way of thinking, asceticism, with his stories about even the poor being invited to a banquet. That's in Luke 14, and there are others. He says, the poor, we want them to come along. We've got feasting, and he's feasting and drinking and befriending tax collectors and sinners. And that's Matthew 11, where he's accused of being a glutton, isn't he? He's accused of feasting with tax collectors and the sinners. And he says, John the Baptist came not doing these things. Now the Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and it seems we both.
Still not.
Yeah. And Paul also acts the idea that it was wrong to marry. I mean, he did make the point, as you're aware, in I think it's 1 Corinthians chapter 8. He talks about food offered to idols, doesn't he? And he says, look, if it upsets somebody, then okay, but actually there's nothing wrong in doing that. And in terms of marriage, he says the same. If you must marry, there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, it's probably better to be single because then you can really do the Lord's work. That's his point, isn't it? But he's sort of attacking the idea that it was somehow wrong. And there were groups within the church in those early days that believed it was very important to remain celibate. Doesn't necessarily do much for the growth of the church, but nonetheless,
If you're not
that
married,
was
it
the way.
is about you.
Indeed, and not to marry.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far.
There were some. Anyway, we won't go into that. Okay. However, an increasing number of believers from the 4th century onwards began to embrace the benefits of self-denial and especially celibacy. So some, even before Constantine, took vows of abstinence and saw acts of penance and great virtue. I probably haven't expressed that very well. By great virtue, I mean acts of great virtue, good works and things, and so on, as a means of dealing with sin. So one would say, you know, we deal with sin by being penitential, and one says we deal with sin by occupying ourselves positively, you know, because it's, well, hard to sit still and be good type of thing. You get the idea?
The devil makes work for us.
Yeah, all that, yes. So several church leaders, and in those early church leaders, they really were encouraging. So that's Tertullian and Origen and Cyprian in particular. They're encouraging what they see then as a higher level of holiness. Yeah. So did you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I sort of get it.
Mm.
I understand
Mm.
why it was effective, why they saw that it was important.
And I think if we can look at it with something like maybe 4th or 5th century is the best, that sort of mind, it makes more sense than looking at it with the 21st century mind, I think.
Is it also not entirely selfish?
Well, that would be an accusation that would be made.
Yeah.
I mean, who's supporting these people?
They are being supported.
Sure. I mean, the current, well, I can't remember the flavour of the Jews that do this, but there's a bunch of them that the men don't work. They go to, I don't know what, their schools every day to learn about the Torah, and they're absolved from every social responsibility in Israel, and they're fully supported.
And have any of you worked in predominantly Buddhist countries?
No. Well, amongst the same.
Very much the same.
Same.
Still today. Yeah.
So that's just my observation that
I can see that too.
I mean, I guess it's a challenge for all of us that our period that we live in is obviously time limited as far as what future generations will need. Because if everyone spends time in a monastery and that's their life, and the word of God doesn't go out necessarily following Matthew 28.
Well, that's right.
Yes, and yes, in the end of Matthew 28, which indeed is the missional command, isn't it?
So that's where, you know, although the gospel message doesn't change, the delivery may. And although I can understand the monastery aspect, it's only for a period of time, surely.
Well, in many cases it wasn't. You see
I
that,
know, and that's the challenge.
but we come to a point where I think it starts to make even more sense. So here are church fathers, church leaders, who are supporting this. Now they're all persecuted. I mentioned Cyprian and Origen. Cyprian's martyred. Origen's, well, might as well have been martyred, really. Tertullian seems to, I mean, he keeps getting exiled. So so they're all having to deal with this, but this is when Christians are persecuted that I'm at. And the thing is that it changes then how we think about this when Christians aren't persecuted anymore. So if we move on to Anthony there, Anthony is regarded by many as the first hermit. You know, the Greek word for desert is eremos, and that's where the word hermit comes from. Okay, the desert dwellers. He took Jesus' words literally. Remember, if you want to be perfect, go and sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. Now, he's 20 years old, and that's what he does. So, born in 250, so still under persecution, in times of persecution. He lived, again, historians differ a bit on that, but he did live to a huge age, and many say he lived even to 105, which is a good age even today, never mind then. So the ascetic life clearly suited him. So living a solitary life in a tomb, this peasant from Egypt battled with temptations involving devils, dangerous animals, and women.
There you go.
Now, if you get that's what they write about, you see. Now we can see why that might be the case. Okay. His example, however, proved to be contagious, and before long, many hermits living alone or in small groups were living on the edges of the desert. And so their lifestyle consisted of prayer, meditation, reading the Bible, and fasting. But some took these to even greater extremes, standing for hours while praying. So how holy can you get, you see? Living in trees, refusing to wash, eating grass, silly things in some cases. And hours of loneliness, a poor diet and loss of sleep must have contributed to hallucinations. I've put in brackets as well as awareness of God, because that was actually what they were seeking. Giving rise to tales of strange and frightening encounters with the forces of evil. And if you really have a mind to, you can read about these wretched things. But I think we can well understand now, with our probably limited understanding of mental illness and mental sickness, why this would be. You could imagine that, you sit in the desert for a couple of years and,
It'd be interesting to know how they made sense of the two wild men in the catacombs that Jesus met, that they couldn't contain. They were on their own doing the same thing, hallucinating and doing all sorts of things. So,
well, he's described in the New Testament as being possessed by demons.
Yeah.
It's interesting that in our penal system, solitary confinement is used as a punishment. And,
it's interesting also because a lot of these people who were ascetics, although they were solitary, at some levels they did have community. I mean, some deliberately made themselves absolutely solitary, but many of them had interactions, and we'll see how that worked.
Did it progress over time?
It did progress over time. It did progress.
Set up small communities, and then they actually sister helping people in the local area, that type of thing.
It's absolutely so. When we talk about monasticism or even asceticism, we just have to be careful not just to home in on the extremes. Every movement finishes up with extremes, it seems to me.
I don't. Early on, can I just ask you? You said we understand it more when you think of that time to our time, which, yes, we can't look at it through 21st century. But what did you mean by that? That at that time, why is it that you?
I mean that there's a particular state, the world and the Roman Empire then are quite different from what we know. And so sort of before Constantine, people might be persecuted and getting away. But after Constantine, there's another reason why they start going out into the desert and forming monastic communities. And really in their thinking is we can really get closer to God. But it's not just that, but we'll come to it. Yeah. Whereas I think in our Western society, especially in a country like Australia, where in general we're not poor. I mean, I worked plenty in South Melbourne with people who'd not made good decisions and probably were poor in many ways, but not really, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
I was also thinking about other cultures too use the preservation of the West or the spiritual life, besides Christianity.
And there are modern versions as well that we probably don't come across too much. Yeah. So we've got we can see why people feel sometimes they're fighting with the devil. I mean, as recently as Martin Luther, and this is centuries. I mean, Martin Luther's modern. He writes about this sort of thing, but he was a monk originally. Okay, Athanasius writes this: the sign of solitary ascetics rules from one end of the earth to the other. So he's saying they're all over the place. Athanasius is later. Now, the explanation for this sudden rise in the popularity of asceticism, and here's my suggestion, okay, seems to lie with the conversion of Constantine and the rise in nominal Christianity.
That's interesting.
Now, I try to explain that a bit better. I confess most of this is my thoughts, so you can take or leave it. Faithful believers prepared to die rather than deny Christ during the time of Diocletian were replaced, and I could put almost overnight, by half-converted Christians seeking advantage for themselves.
Well, I've heard it said that the worst thing that happened to Christianity was the fact that it became the official religion of Rome.
And that's the question, isn't it? Was it the best thing that happened to Christianity, or was it the worst?
The worst thing. I could see where people are coming from, making statements like the worst.
Yeah, there are other advantages.
Yeah,
spread.
but I get the point. I think the point about nominal Christianity is a really interesting one.
Well, this is what Gregory of now we've come across Gregory of Nazianzus. You can tell me who was Gregory of Nazianzus.
He was one of the two Greeks.
He was one of the two Gregs. He was one of the Cappadocian fathers. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Two Greeks and a Basil.
Two Gregs and a Basil with the Cappadocian fathers, and Greg of Nazianzus was the one that wasn't related to the other two, but he was Basil's mate. Okay, now this is what he said: the chief seat is gained by evil doing, not by virtue, and the sees, the bishoprics, the sees belong not to the more worthy, but to the more powerful. So that's what that's I think a very important part of hermits, ascetics, monks. I think it's a very important part of their thinking.
I think people are somewhat disappointed with the official religion, and they're looking to gain more spiritual insight by going off that also.
Yeah, because somehow I suspect in their thinking that the true believers are difficult to find now. When they were persecuted, that was easy. Yeah.
Would that have also helped in terms of, because they were praying and looking at the scriptures, etc., would that have helped in other ways too, because they were keeping to that what they were reading? You know, they weren't
keeping to the true faith. True. Yeah, I'm sure. I think, and so the prayer and the Bible reading and the meditation and the fasting, which is clearly a sort of regarded as a Godward thing. These are all ways that we can maintain our closeness to God.
And
this is how
today too. 10 Bible study groups, so
Yeah.
engage in like a prayer triplet or something like that. Or,
Yeah.
Come here.
yeah.
Well, people have told me over years and years, they feel closer to God on the beach, in the country, and away. And I'm thinking,
Away from
what's
people.
what's with the fellowship of God's people? What does how does that work?
Well, I think it's, I can understand their comment on an individual level.
Mm,
When you're on your own, sitting somewhere on your own in a beautiful place that you know God's made, you can definitely
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Absolutely.
But collectively, I think it's one thing to be single out and be on your own. So it's another thing to be with a collection of other Christians. That's also great as well. And that's
we call that a retreat, though. Retreat.
yeah. And then you think,
For a
oh,
short
I've
period
had
of
this
time.
lot, I'm off, sort of thing.
that's kind
That's
of
why I
retreat's kind of big in certain parts of the church. The idea of retreat. I always felt it sounds like we're running away, and I'm not that keen on the word, but I sort of yeah.
What I like about this quote from the second Greek,
Yeah.
it's a good argument to have church and state completely separate.
I think it's a very good argument to have
Because
them separate.
they got into trouble as a church got too enmeshed in with the power of the state.
The church, because the church becomes part of the political
And
structure
there
of the
are plenty
nation.
of contemporary examples of that today.
Absolutely.
And that's the same. That's the whole story. We're not in early church history. That's the whole story of the Holy Roman Empire.
Oh, the good
Christendom.
Christendom, Iran,
All that. And so we can see how we're getting there, because the leadership of the church is becoming a place of power politically. And so these people are saying, yeah, we're not true Christians. How can we maintain our vibrant true faith? Now we might say that's not the answer, but that was their answer.
I can see that, yeah.
Okay, let's move on. So hermits then were escaping not so much the world as the worldly church. Yeah? You can disagree with me if you want. Okay. What they probably rightly perceived as a corrupt institution. And that's a problem. They hoped to gain a closer walk with God in the desert to pray for the world and for the church. They were going there, well, sometimes, mostly, I'd like to think, for the right reason. Okay. Well, we'll come to that, Louis, because I can see where you're about to go with this. Okay, let's go on the next paragraph on the next page. Some hermits attracted vast crowds from the cities who came to listen to their godly wisdom. Okay, so there is that sense as well. When I was at primary school, we used to sing one of those funny folk songs, which started with, "Once in a blithe green wood lived a hermit wise and good, who the folks from far and near for his counsel sought, knowing well that what he taught, the weariest of hearts would cheer," or something like that. Anyway, so they came to listen. Okay. So I think possibly Don has a sort of a primary school English background as well, which may be where it comes from.
I remember it, but unlike you, I can remember it.
Why I still know it, I have no idea. Okay. Anyway, so troubled was Simeon by the crowds at the entrance to the cave where he lived, that he erected a pillar and lived on it for over 30 years. So he's called Simeon Stylites or Stylites. And as he became known, he preached to the crowds beneath, and many were converted, you see. So, but we are now starting to get weird, don't you think? And Gary brought this up a couple of weeks ago, didn't you remember? Gary mentioned that about Simeon or Simon Stylites, and and he's sitting on top of Paul for 30 years, and you know, there were certain practical considerations that we have to think of. And the last, I'm leaving out one of the others, but disciples sent food up in a basket, and of course some copied his eccentric lifestyle. Okay, so that's what he does. So this is an incredibly godly man.
To see the highest on the list.
It did get higher, yes.
Was he one of the highest?
I think he was, yeah. In fact, my recollection, and I must admit I didn't go into it deeply, but my recollection is they would up higher and higher, as if it was sort of somehow more holy.
Closer to God.
Mm.
So you're holier than the next guy next to you, who's on his own God.
Oh, just a novice.
Competition's pro-
But well,
Raises all sorts of images in my head.
now it's odd because we think, we just don't think that's eccentric. We think that's positively sick. That's weird. That's totally odd. I don't know quite how the 4th century people understood that.
They must have been impressed if they came to listen to the
They
gospel.
were, and they did.
And they probably associated their privation
Mm.
to holiness and to
Mm.
spiritual enlightenment.
Mm.
So earning the way.
Well, that's how they may see it. Yeah.
And the difficulty, Lewis, with that is that I think our natural reaction is, yeah, earning your way by being more holy. Did they? He's not here to defend himself.
No, that's right.
But yeah. So
Yeah.
good old Simeon.
But there were some later ones, I imagine,
So
the past, that the ones who were considered holy and spiritually enlightened were recruited to be part of the official church.
yeah, and we will come to that, because we do have people like Jerome, we do have people like Basil, who themselves were ascetic monks of one form or another, but not like this. Okay, now we come to Pachomius, and he's quite an important person because now he was born in 292. So although we're pre-Constantine's conversion, Constantine is converted when he's very young. So, okay. He lived till 348. He is credited with instituting the first Christian monastery in 320. And that was in Egypt at a place called Tavanisi. And his story is that he was aged 21 when he was forcibly recruited into the Roman army. And he was sent down the Nile to Thebes. And when they got there, all these new young army, what would they call them? Sort of novices, I suppose. Recruits were looked after by the Christians. The Christians brought them food and clothing and looked after them as people who cared for them. And he was so impressed by this that in a few years later, when he was able to leave the army, he became a Christian himself. And he was still only by that time kind of 22 or something. And so he instituted the first Christian monastery in 320. But instead of allowing the monks to live as hermits with their own rules, you know, where you make your own rules up and do what you like, he regulated their lives with manual work, a common uniform, fixed hours, and a strict discipline.
Well, that still the case in the Middle Ages, wasn't it?
This is, yeah, so this is becoming much more like what we know about monasteries.
I imagine that didn't appeal to everybody, though. Some probably liked, being on their own.
I suspect some of them probably liked being on their own and didn't want to be with people and wanted to make their own rules and do what I would imagine that probably was so.
Some people would have liked not having to think for themselves and being told what to do.
Oh, no, that's another thing. Yes.
Does it also mean too that-
Sydney Andy.
Sorry.
Do you know, have to know how to sing it?
Just chance.
Just
Yeah.
No, we're not told what to do. If you don't do it, don't do the right thing.
But we certainly recognize the value here of manual work. We recognize the value of having some sort of uniform, so you're not going to lord it over others. And we recognize the value of having fixed hours.
I don't know whether this was the case then, but eventually they formed some sort of public service, didn't they?
Yep.
Providing hospitals.
Yep.
Feeding the poor.
Yep. Now, the Greek for common life, the koinos bios is the Greek is one of the Greek words for life, gave rise to the term of cenobitic monasticism. I've been showing off by putting the O after the C. You can write it without that O if you want to. To join, monks handed over their personal wealth to a common fund and served a period of probation. They were required also to memorize parts of the Bible, or were taught to read if they were illiterate, and later he oversaw the establishment of monastic communities for women. Okay, so you do have a sort of get out clause, but it doesn't last for very long in terms of a lifetime.
Isn't it? Well, that was the case in Sound of Music with the.
Sorry, are you?
That's true too, isn't it?
Are you?
No, I go to bed when it's on. Can't watch it.
I must admit, I don't watch Sound of Music either, but nonetheless, I'm sure it makes some extremely good points.
It does. My wife.
My wife too. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, Maria started off on probation in the.
Yes.
Didn't work.
Yes.
No, she hadn't made any vows to stay, so she could get out.
And we still do.
But the nun also, the head nun also thought that she could still do God's work outside the monastery.
Yeah.
No, so it wasn't her role.
But we still do.
It's in life.
We still do stuff like that in some of the professions, don't we? That, I mean, admittedly, you know, it doesn't have quite the same control over your life, but I think when I started teaching, I had to do a year's probation.
Yeah.
I did.
Year's probation, get a teaching certificate.
So anyway, that was them. Athanasius introduced monasticism to the West. So you appreciate up till this time, it's been a peculiar sort of Eastern type activity.
This was very West.
And he spent, because you remember, he kept getting exiled, Athanasius, and he is spending 6 years in Trier, which is in Germany. And he wrote the life of Antony. He was impressed with Antony, and he wrote it while he was in exile. So again, Basil, who was been mentioned before. Basil, I'm just reminding you, he was born in 330. He died relatively young, 379. He returned to Cappadocia in 356, determined to live as a hermit, and with Gregory of Nazianzus set up his own community. Okay. As Bishop of Caesarea, remember this is a different Caesarea, as Bishop of Caesarea from 370, he was both bishop and ascetic. He integrated the monastery with the church, so helping monastic communities to become more outward looking. This is just what you were saying earlier, exactly the same. Now this is, I thought, I'll just read Basil's prayer. Basil's prayer. I have sinned, O Lord. I have sinned before heaven and before your face. I have provoked your goodness. I have transgressed your commandments. I have not obeyed your statutes. And goes on, of course, to ask for forgiveness. So he has a very thorough understanding of his sinfulness and the grace of God, which is what we're thinking about in church today. I've heard 2 sermons on the topic today. I'm sort of feeling very holy. Okay. Now, thoughts about this one. He set down 8 daily times of prayer, but disapproved of extreme individual piety.
But everybody had to do 8.
That was part of the rule of his monastery.
So if you did 10.
I think he might have decided you were being a bit extreme.
Because peeling potatoes in the kitchen.
But you did 7.
Well, since everybody turned up to these things, if they were part of the community, you know, I don't know what they did with people who absented themselves, but you know, doubtless somebody's made a movie about that at some stage. I don't think that was even considered. I mean, if you're in, then you want to be in. So 8 times.
Peer pressure to get people to conform.
It's what you do. Yeah, it's what you do.
If you have a headache, you still win.
I think that's probably right. I guess if you were actually dying, you might be excused.
I mean, it's interesting that prayer was given prominence.
Yep.
Because the outside world doesn't make sense of it. Why would you be spending all this time in the day praying? I mean, I hear of it even in my work environment. Certain Christian organisations will not be contacted at certain times because the organisation is praying, and the rest of the world, you know, they can't get a hold of them, can't make sense of it.
And because it inconveniences them.
Absolutely, and they can't understand what prayer is about.
Yeah, it's interesting.
My friend, or one of more of a colleague than a friend, he made the mistake on the wishes of his parish council of giving them his whole week's timetable and what he did with his time.
Oh, no.
And I said, I think that is a stupid thing to do because none of us have set times anyway. It's virtually impossible. And he included prayer times. And apparently the parish council said to him, we're not paying you to pray. You can do that in your own time. So
That could be misquoted so easily.
There's so much in there to take that.
Oh dear. Okay. So prayer, there's a danger in our society that prayer gets tagged on as an afterthought when we're not doing anything else. We're not likely to say, sorry, I can't come, I'm praying. I don't think that normally happens.
I would say I'm doing something else. I wouldn't say I was.
Well, Jesus retreated.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, people were looking for him.
So Basil is saying, if you join my community, here are times that we pray. And that's what we're going to be doing. So in fact, prayer is at the center of things. It's not used as a tag-on afterthought.
But when you look at all the other things like medical treatment, poor relief, education, they had such an incredible place in the community that
So
other things wouldn't. These things wouldn't happen if it wasn't for places like this.
Yeah, right.
And when you think about prayer 8 times a day, even if it was 20 minutes 8 times a day, you think about what sometimes you do, like in the evenings, you might sit and do nothing much. There's a lot. It's not that much. I mean, I don't mean I want to do it necessarily. I mean, with their daily life, it works out.
There are people in our churches today who are very committed to prayer and do a lot of praying.
Certainly are.
And I'm partly because I keep going away and asking people to pray for me while I'm doing locums in other places. I'm kind of starting to get to know who they are, and it's a great blessing.
Imagine that we don't have this trouble. leader and other distractions we have today, like internet or.
That's what I was sort of
whatever.
thinking.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
things that take up our free time.
What I'm interested in is I think I would be almost certain that this is where Islam got its prayer ideas from. I think Islam nicked it from the Christian monastic movement. In fact, I'm almost certain that it probably.
Never trust a herd.
So, and I'm not saying they were wrong to do that, but I'm sure that's where it comes from. Anyway, something to think of. Yes, go on.
It's just a pity they didn't nick a bit more of Christianity than they.
Yeah, well, the trouble is that again, that's a whole different subject, isn't it, Glenn? But they did nick things from Christianity and from Judaism, and
But not enough.
but then created something else.
That's right.
Mm.
Yeah.
Let's move on to John Cassin, because John Cassin, now we're getting a little bit later. So we're at 360 to 435, John Cassian. He'd visited Egypt. He founded a monastery and convent in Marseille in 415, and he wrote detailed instructions, including clothing and monastery services, but also on fighting temptation. He was the most influential promoter of the monastic movement in the West until Benedict, who you will have heard of, founded the monastery at Monte Cassino in 529. And some of you might have even been there. I don't know.
Yeah. We've driven past. It's on the road from Naples up to Rome.
Yeah.
That was a huge, big. It's very high up.
Yeah.
There's a terrible, terrible battle.
World War II.
World War II, yes.
Yeah.
It
was a huge barrier.
Yeah, very short.
Yeah.
The Germans had fortified it, overlooks the only way up.
Yeah.
That side of Italy. And anyway, yeah, but it's unbelievably big place now.
Yeah.
You can't miss it. You drive up the road and you
saw it from the
know it's there,
Yeah.
right hand side of the road.
Pretty sure you can see it from the train.
And it's set in a place which would be just perfect for your monastery.
Oh yeah.
So it's interesting though, because somebody's mentioned that, I can't remember who it was. He was aware of the perils of monasticism and considered some monks no better than vagabonds. Yeah. So who brought that? Somebody mentioned that.
But that vagabond's really a wanderer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Vagrant is Latin.
Vagrancy.
Wandering, I think.
And the fact that I'm kind of not prepared to fend for myself in a way.
Yeah, I get a free meal.
Vagabond.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah,
You don't have to work for your keep. Well, you did have to work for your keep.
that's right. Yeah.
But
However, strict discipline with restraint, this is the mark of Benedict, you see. Strict discipline with restraint and some freedom were the marks of Benedict's rule. A novitiate was free to leave during a time of testing, at least a year, then took the threefold vows: poverty, chastity, obedience, and then was permanently cut off from the world. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't do, I mean, they might farm, they might provide vegetables. In the case of ultimately Benedictine monasteries produced a rather well-known liqueur.
absolutely.
And
Excellent.
which I know nothing about. Okay.
So poverty's out the window, chastity, all the money.
Well, poverty, chastity, we've got to be careful that we don't sort of relate too much to the monasteries of the Middle Ages, where things have probably in some cases gone a bit wrong, and Henry goes and dissolves them all. But I think, yes, chastity, yeah, interesting. Poverty, I mean, they're not in the world, they're working there for others. Obedience.
What was the guy in the Name of the Rose? You know, that better echo book where he was a monk. But from
Yeah,
a learned
He was
institution,
a scholar.
it was the scholar too. So he went
it's a
out
long
and-
time since I've seen.
I'm just thinking, would they be sort of similar in the sense he belongs to a monastic community or something?
Look, I'm sure that's probably accurate in that respect. Yeah, but whether they were all like that, I don't know.
No, I'm sure they weren't all like that.
Yeah.
Just that-
Yeah. So monasticism. So what I'm going to do, I put. So what do you think were the benefits or drawbacks of the monastic movement? And can I leave that and quickly go on to the papacy, because
I had a list, but anyway.
I've done some dot points about that, and I'm conscious that we're for a number of reasons getting later. So the papacy. So we've really got to sort of skew our brain now to something else. These are again are kind of dot points without dots. For many millions throughout the world, the Pope is the vicar of Christ. For others, the Antichrist. Were any of you brought up in churches that identified the Pope as the Antichrist in Revelation? It was around.
Oh, well,
It was around. Yeah.
that term was never used, but when I was growing up a Methodist in
Yep.
an English town.
Yep.
Catholics were not respected
Yeah.
in general conversation.
Yep.
And they were very hard to find.
Yep.
I saw my first Catholic friend in Australia.
Well, it was that way of thinking was around in the church I was brought up.
I was brought up in a family where my father was an Irish Protestant, so Catholics were despised. It was mentioned. It was mentioned that in the papacy in France.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
In Australia, that stopped. That sort of chatter stopped.
I trust we're totally over that. Sometimes I think we are, and then once in Goulburn, I got a young couple where an Anglican girl was marrying or wanted to marry a Roman Catholic boy, and discovered there's still a bit of it around.
Oh,
Somebody's family.
My family.
Okay.
right?
So my mother was a devout Catholic from a devout Catholic family. My father's family were Protestant, but never set foot in a church.
Yeah, the church they didn't go to.
When Mum got married, none of her family went to the wedding. Father would never give her away.
Yeah.
Not her sisters, her brothers, no one.
Yeah, so
And she married into a family that hated Catholics, so she wasn't accepted in Dad's side.
yeah. Well, could I'll just carry on. This unique institution has survived and even thrived for many centuries. Can we discover something about the origins of the papal office and how its foundations were laid? The First Vatican Council, now we're in 1870, so it's relatively recent, claimed that Jesus Christ established the papacy with Peter, and the Bishop of Rome, Peter's successor, has supreme authority over the whole church. Okay, that's where the Roman Catholic Church, in theory, is at today. Protestant denominations and the Eastern Orthodox Church deny these claims, often vigorously. Okay, now you remember the word that was used for the early church, certainly up to the 4th century, was Catholic, meaning worldwide, and as people like to point out to me sometimes, the Anglican Church is Catholic, but we don't use the word because it confuses people. And the word Orthodox, so Catholic, sort of refers to the worldwide nature, the global nature of the church, and Orthodox refers to the truth. Okay. The term Pope didn't become reserved for the Bishop of Rome until the 6th century. It comes from the word Papa, which simply referred to the fatherly care of any bishop for his flock. Do we think of bishops as fathers? Father in God type of stuff? I think the answer probably is we don't generally, but an awful lot of the Anglican Church does, I can tell you.
that because of decision-making capacity or because of their godliness?
I don't know why it is. I had terrible trouble trying to persuade people in South Melbourne not to call me father. Even Anglicans. I don't know how well I've succeeded.
We haven't started yet, but who knows?
During the early centuries of Christian history, Rome was the empire's capital, the eternal city. The church in Rome was the largest and wealthiest. That's sort of a given. It's just an observation. Despite persecutions, sorry, I've turned the page. Despite persecutions, church membership in Rome is thought to have been 30,000 with 150 clergy by 250 AD. So it is growing. But remember, it's growing under persecution. I say despite persecutions. Tertullian would say because of persecutions.
That's an interesting ratio.
It's huge, isn't it?
200.
We would
200 per clergyman.
We would be horrified today at the thought. The only way we can argue that clergy are responsible for that many people is if you include all the nominals that claim they are part of the church, but you never see them until it's a funeral. Several early Christian writers, notably Irenaeus, referred to Peter and Paul as founders of the church in Rome, with subsequent bishops as their successors. Now, I don't know whether I've explained this very well, but this may have been a safeguard against the secret traditions of Gnosticism. What I'm trying to say is, Gnosticism was big, as you remember. I think that's quite early when Gary was doing the course. And Gnosticism had all these sort of secret traditions and was actually quite hard to pin down. And it may be that Irenaeus was trying to put some reality behind the existence of the church rather than secrecy. But yeah. Able church leaders such as Irenaeus and Cyprian, however, had no problem correcting Rome if the bishop was in error. Before Constantine, the Bishop of Rome exercised no jurisdiction outside Rome. The first bishop to claim superior authority was Stephen. This is before Constantine. And he did it based on Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. And even if you can't tell me the exact reference, I wouldn't be surprised if you can tell me what it says. You are Peter, and on this rock. Yeah. One of my stained glass windows in St. Luke's in South Melbourne was you are Peter and on this rock, but I don't think it referred to Peter being the head of the church. Okay. Cyprian considered every see to be the see of Peter and disputed with Stephen, though he admitted the see of Rome should be honoured. But no one of us sets himself up as a bishop of bishops. This is the first among equals argument.
Yeah.
Yep. The church not unnaturally began to adopt the political structure of the empire, so larger cities began to exercise authority in their larger regions, like still happens, the Diocese of Sydney is Sydney, the province of New South Wales, the chief diocese is regarded as Sydney, I think still, even if the people outside don't necessarily agree with everything. I think that's how it works. Yeah. So Rome is the chief church in Italy, Carthage in North Africa, Alexandria in Egypt, and Antioch in Syria. The Council of Nicaea recognized the preeminence of Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch, with honorary primacy granted to Jerusalem. And we get all that. Then in 330, Constantine moved his residence east to Byzantium, so the political center of the empire became Constantinople, thus increasing that city's power and influence while Rome's declined. That's history. Yep. Theodosius I made Christianity the state religion and called a general council at Constantinople, which you will remember, where he made a personal appearance. So just as Constantine appears personally at Nicaea, Theodosius appears personally at Constantinople in 381. It is now, by the law of the empire, mandatory virtually to be a Christian.
Now the Jews are voting.
And you remember that the Nicene Creed really, although it's based on the Creed of Nicaea, really comes out of Constantinople in 381. Only Eastern bishops were present. In addition to confirming and renewing the Creed of Nicaea was this assertion: the Bishop of Constantinople shall take precedence immediately after the Bishop of Rome, because his city, Constantinople, is the new Rome. Now, should Rome be alarmed by this, since they're saying Constantinople comes behind Rome? Well, Rome was alarmed by it, because it sounds as if Constantinople is suddenly becoming more and more important. The center of the empire is Constantinople. What's going to happen to Rome?
So basically we've got Jerusalem now being Rome and Constantinople being a rival to Rome as potentially the new Jerusalem.
I think Jerusalem was an exercise in tokenism.
Yes,
quite
so there's
honestly.
that sense of this is where people go, a bit like the temple mindset of Jerusalem.
But in reality, it's Rome and Constantinople now.
Yeah.
And how political is that? Because that's the empire. That's how it's all working. The Bishop of Rome, whose name at the time was Damasus, objected to what the Western Church saw as a deliberate attempt to set up a confrontation between Old Rome and New Rome and move church authority to the east. Now, you see how that works, even though, Constantinople still comes behind Rome, but the empire's moved. What's the next step? And he's alarmed about this. And so he says, Rome's preeminence does not rest on the decrees of a council or an accident of history. So what does he think Rome's preeminence rests on?
Peter.
Yes, absolutely. Peter and Paul. He says that this is where they came, this is where they died, this is what counts. Well, bishops from the West met in Rome the next year and claimed primacy for Rome based on that same verse. Now, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. And this is actually the first mention of primacy of the Roman Church, even though others, Stephen had tried to claim it before, but this is the first time it's actually said. Rome is the place. Now, it's interesting because Rome is changing. Constantinople is becoming more and more and more important, and Rome is in serious decline at the same time. So, in Constantinople, politics and the church grew more intertwined as the new Rome grew in political influence. The bishop therefore began to lose his independence. So the bishop's not so important now. The story in Rome was different. The city was in decline and the empire weak, leading to greater independence for the bishop. He could no longer rely on Rome, the capital of empire, so he starts arguing from Peter's primacy and the way he interprets, I've put his understanding, and I could have said the way he interprets Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. Now, is Jesus saying it's Peter, or is Jesus saying It's the fact that Peter has just confessed the truth about Jesus. Because it would be unusual to refer to a person as this. And if we read other parts of the New Testament, one would be 1 Corinthians 10, one would be the early second chapter, I think, of 1 Peter, where Jesus himself is referred to as the rock, not Peter. I think it's just one of those funny conveniences that Peter had a name that meant, well, rocky, stone, rock. But this is it. You create a whole primacy, ultimately a dynasty on Rome, and it becomes more so, as we'll see later, which I'll get to very quickly. Bishop Damasus pointed to the churches built by Constantine on the supposed graves of Peter and Paul. I don't know if you remember, but it was a big deal to commemorate where some important biblical event had happened by building a shrine on top of it, which I find annoying, but that's what they do. That's what they did. And Constantine was particularly guilty, often on his mother's say-so, for doing that. Though the apostles came from the east, they were martyred in Rome. So this is Bishop Damasus' claim. So Rome has a superior right to claim them as citizens.
Well, because they killed them.
Yep. They were martyred. But when we come to Leo, we can start to see how it starts to really gain traction, this way of thinking. So Leo becomes bishop in 440.
Yeah.
Before his election, he'd been sent by the emperor to Gaul to arbitrate in a dispute. So he's brought back because he's an arbitrator, a leading citizen. He is brought back to become Bishop of Rome. And in his first sermon, he says, "The glory of the blessed apostle Peter, in whose chair his power lives on, and his authority shines forth." So Leo is regarding himself as the supreme head of the church worldwide, and he appeals to 3 scripture passages where he claims this. Now, they all refer to Peter. And one we know because we've seen it before. And one is Jesus talking to Peter before the denial. And one is that John's Gospel where he says to Peter, "Feed my sheep." Yeah, you can look those up. He doesn't include where Peter denies Jesus. That's not one of the verses he appeals to. Okay. So whereas Constantine's policy had been to preserve the unity of the church as kind of the cement of empire, Leo is contravening this now by raising Rome's status and making it the dynasty of Peter. Do you see what's going on? He's not actually looking for a unified church. Well, it's unified on its own terms. It's unified as the dynasty of Peter rather than the cement of empire. If it was going to be unified as the cement of empire, it should be in Constantinople. There are plenty of difficulties in Leo's use of Bible text to support his claim, and you've probably thought of some already. And one would be Jesus' teaching on humble service. Yep. Now, the emperor, this is Valentinian III, because the empire is now back in 2 again, and he's based in Ravenna. Does Ravenna have a second N in it? No, it doesn't matter. Issued a decree in 445, and his decree says the Roman commander must compel bishops to attend, however unwillingly, the bishop's court in Rome. So Leo wants the bishops to come to his council or synod, or whatever it is, and Valentinian says that the Romans, the commander there must command them to come. So Leo's kind of, in a way, making his own laws now, and the emperor's supporting them. At Chalcedon, Leo's influence was so strong that bishops would shout in jubilation, "Peter has spoken through Leo." Did we talk about this last week? I think we did. Even so, the same council gave equal authority to the Bishop of Constantinople, so the Christian church had two heads. But in practice, because of Leo and history, it doesn't quite work out like that, though obviously the Eastern Church ultimately splits, but not till the 11th century. By this time, Rome was in serious decline, a shadow of its former self. It had already been pillaged by the Visigoths in 410, but worse was to come. So the year after Chalcedon, this is 452, Attila the Hun invaded the empire and advanced on Rome. Leo was commissioned to negotiate. Attila, at Leo's pleading, spared the city and withdrew. So now the bishop is a political diplomat. This is Leo. Now, in fairness, Attila had probably done about as much as he could do. And as I read history, his armies and his men were tired and worn and wanted to go home. So it was actually a bit of a godsend for Attila. And so he, having pillaged virtually most of Europe, decides not to sack Rome. Okay. 3 years later, though, 455, the Vandals come to Rome. Leo met Gaiseric, the king, with a delegation of priests. Isn't this interesting? He's bringing a delegation of priests. He's not bringing a delegation of diplomats and soldiers or anything like that. He's bringing a delegation of priests. He begged for mercy, pleaded with the king not to burn the city, and urged restraint. Now, the story is that when he spoke to Gaiseric, who was in his 60s by this time, sort of nodded as if, sort of in assent, turned and rode his horse off. But they did, in fact, loot the city, and they did it for 14 days, and they loaded their ships with anything that was precious, including any people that might serve their purpose, and headed for Carthage. That was their next port of call.
Did they burn the city?
No.
No.
So they got
Now, this is interesting. They looted the city, but apparently Leo considered that they had shown restraint. So Leo had saved the city. Every house had been looted, but the city was not burned down. There was no massacre, and most churches had been left untouched. Now, you might not consider that particularly work. I suppose it was with restraint, because they didn't burn everything down and loot the churches and everything else.
The churches would have had great wealth. I would have thought.
I don't know the situation then, but they took what wealth they could with them. This was their thing. They were going to loot and pillage, but apparently they didn't destroy on this occasion. So these are the Vandals. I mean, the real Vandals. Leo had said, okay, at a poorly attended Thanksgiving service, obviously people were still terrified, Leo gave thanks to the mercy of the Almighty in softening the rage of the barbarians. Leo, not the emperor, had taken responsibility and saved Rome. He was, as it were, the new Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. That was a heathen title.
That's right. Yeah.
So Leo then, and again, I've just put there, although subsequent centuries will reveal much, much more to make the papacy what it is today, I think we can see how the foundations were laid by then. I put, what do you think? We are 10 minutes behind time, and Helen is in a desperate hurry.
I was just going to mention, I think it was natural for the Roman Church to gain ascendancy only because of their influence, because they're large, they have lots of resources to draw on, and other churches around them would be looking toward them for guidance.
And at this point, where can you put your trust? You can't put your trust in the emperor. No. That's gone. Yeah. Or the city, or anything. If you're going to put your trust, you've got to go Constantinople. What's left?
Do you want to just
Bishop of Rome.
Stop the Zoom?
Oh, shall I? I'll stop the Zoom now, and let you go. And thank you very much for stepping in that way and doing something that I'm incapable of.
At the end.